Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to a brand new video here on the second channel. Today, I wanted to join in on the discussion about Snorlax Stall. So, Snorlax Stall is very much the talk of the town right now on Twitter, on YouTube. I've seen multiple YouTube videos from multiple different YouTubers. I've seen a lot of discussion on Twitter all about Snorlax Stall and whether or not it is good for the game and whether or not Snorlax should just be banned from the standard format. Now, Snorlax Stall did just win the Gdansk Regional Championships, which is a big deal. We haven't seen a control deck win a regional since last year's Toronto regionals with Mewtwo v Union Control. But the thing with this is that Snorlax Control might be the worst kind of control deck to play against. So it did just win the Gdansk regionals. We did see in the finals, Aaron immediately conceded game 2 as soon as the Snorlax player going first played a battle VIP pass turn 1, which is pretty hilarious. But yeah, Snorlax is a very powerful archetype right now. It might actually be one of the best decks in the format, and it's definitely got the whole Pokeverse talking about whether or not this deck is actually good for the game. And in this video, I wanted to talk about the deck itself, how to beat it, and my opinions on Snorlax. And I actually don't think Snorlax Control is bad for the game at all. And we're actually going to go back and look at some previous control decks and kind of talk about them and really kind of gauge as to why Snorlax will probably never get banned. I wanted to join in on the discussion. I've kind of seen a lot of talk on Twitter. I've seen a lot of talk on YouTube. I've seen a couple videos from multiple different YouTubers talking about the deck. So I definitely wanted to chime in on the discussion because I do have some opinions on Snorlax. Of course, let me know in the comments below, what are your opinions on Snorlax, and also what are your opinions on stall/control/lock decks in general? I would be very interested to hear about all that. And of course, you're new here to the second channel, make sure to subscribe down below. We're on the road to 10,000 subscribers. So Snorlax, yes, the regional winning deck itself. So Snorlax did just get a big buff with Paradox Rift, mainly because it now has Counter Catcher, which puts the deck on a whole nother level. Counter Catcher is one of the best cards the deck got. Also, gaining access to Erica's Invitation is also pretty dirty. Erica is a very good card for the deck too. So Snorlax just gained a ton of resources with Paradox Rift that make it even more powerful and even more broken than it already was, kind of. Snorlax wasn't that good before, but now it's even better, and now it's on another level. Now, the thing with Snorlax compared to other control decks is Snorlax is just not fun to play against. The idea behind the deck is quite literally that you can't play the game at all. So, obviously, the point of the deck is your opponent is trying to stick something in the active spot that cannot attack or retreat with Snorlax in the active spot. The idea is something that literally just can't do anything, like Manaphy. There's also cards like Radiant Alakazam, there's Luminion V, there's Squawkabilly even, which can be a good card to stall. There's a lot of cards that can be stalled in the active spot right now. There's also Jirachi. I mean, the list goes on. There's a ton of cards that can be stalled in the active. Not only that, there's also Mimikyu in the deck, which obviously is a very powerful card, as you're able to use Mimikyu to basically make it so your opponent has to go through either this Pokemon that can stall stuff in the active spot or Mimikyu. And again, now that the deck has Counter Catcher and Erica's Invitation, they can easily trap something in the active. It's really not that hard for Snorlax to trap stuff in the active spot. So obviously it creates a very unfun environment. It's not fun to just sit there while you have something stuck in the active and you're just passing every turn while your opponent slowly decks you out with cards like Misfortune Sisters, or if they play something like Crabominable V. It's just not a fun time. Obviously, it's not a fun game. You're not really actually even playing the game, and it obviously can be very frustrating to play against. But here's my reason why I think Snorlax is good for the game, or at least why it shouldn't be banned. So I don't think Snorlax is the worst control deck we've ever seen. I just think right now, in our current format, with all these decks being super fast, super aggressive, I think it just allows Snorlax to be a better deck. That's ultimately what makes Snorlax such a good deck right now. It's not because the deck itself is inherently broken. Like, in all honesty, this is a pretty tame control deck to what we've seen in the past from other control decks, which we will look at later on in the video here, other control decks that were much more powerful and much more cause for ban than Snorlax ever was. Snorlax is only good because of how fast the format is. Every deck right now is trying to go fast, they're trying to be aggressive, they're trying to be turbo, they're trying to basically have a board where their turn 2 is extremely powerful. Most decks are trying to do that right now. We got Miraidon, Charizard, Shenpao. All these decks are really just trying to capitalize on this insane board state by going fast, and by doing that, they're sacrificing a lot of the real answers to Snorlax. Snorlax is allowed to be good because it keeps a lot of these aggressive turbo decks in check. And I think that's healthy for the game. I mean, obviously, I think our format is honestly pretty good right now. I think we're in a pretty good format at the moment with Paradox Rift. And I don't think Snorlax is a problematic deck. Yes, it's not fun to play against. And obviously, if I were to pick a deck to play against out of any deck in the room, I would probably choose Snorlax dead last. Like, I would rather play against, like, Charizard or Lost Box or Giratina or Shenpao over Snorlax any day of the week. But a deck like this existing, it means that the meta is actually good and healthy. It means that a deck like this can actually thrive. Again, we haven't seen a control deck this good since Toronto Regionals. We have seen other control decks doing pretty good in the past too, but one actually winning a Regionals and making a big name for itself like Mewtwo did is really the kind of the catalyst as to why Snorlax control is so good right now, is because the meta is healthy enough where it actually allows it to be good. And we're going to kind of look at other ways that Snorlax has seen play within the past. But yeah, I don't think it should be banned at all. I think it keeps the format in check. Another argument I've seen about Snorlax is that it makes for very boring stream experiences. As you saw, they have no choice but to stream the finals of a major regionals, which means they had no choice but to put Snorlax on stream. Which, you know, it is what it is. Obviously, streaming a control deck is not ideal in that scenario, but at the end of the day, you got to stream it, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. In fact, I think it can make for some interesting games. If the player actually has an out or sees a window of opportunity to beat the Snorlax deck, you know, I think it can make for an entertaining match. Obviously, it might not be super entertaining to the viewer if the Snorlax player is just going pass, 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 because the Snorlax player actually has to work, while the player who's getting locked can just pass every turn. The Snorlax player does have to constantly play the game in order to make sure they can win in time. And that actually can make things exciting and entertaining, in my opinion. But I will admit, Snorlax Stall is not the greatest stall deck to watch, because it's really not doing anything special. All you're really doing is just preventing your opponent from either attacking or retreating. That's it. Like, they just can't do anything. There's other control decks that have been worse, and they have obviously prevented you from playing the game, but Snorlax is just a bit more boring. But at the end of the day, it can still make for entertaining watch no matter what, because again, the control player has to do actions while the player who's getting locked, sometimes they have a win con. But let's look at some ways to actually beat Snorlax. So Snorlax is not an indestructible deck. I mean, yes, it is beatable. In fact, I think it's one of the most counterable decks in our format right now. So for starters, we have Minior. Minior, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to beat Snorlax right now. Minior's got the ability Far-Flying Meteor, where once you're in turn, if it's on the bench, you can attach an energy from your hand to this Pokemon and switch it with your active Pokemon. So immediately, you can attach energy to Minior and switch it into the active spot, which is pretty darn good. Obviously, that allows you to get around Snorlax's ability if they're stalling something like a Manaphy or a Bibarel. And then you have Gravitational Tackle that does 20 damage for each colorless energy in your opponent's active retreat cost. If we look back at Snorlax, Snorlax has a 4 retreat cost, which means Minior can do 160 damage and 1 KO it. Now, Snorlax will usually play Bravery Charm or Defiance Vest, which means you can't one-shot it. But at the end of the day, you're still doing a ton of damage. In fact, you can donk your opponent. If you make the Snorlax player go first and they just start Snorlax and no other basic, as long as you can find Minior turn 1 with an energy, you can just immediately knock it out if they don't put a tool on it. So Minior is the best counter. It's not the perfect answer. Well, I think it is the best counter to Snorlax right now. It's not the perfect answer because Snorlax can still, again, use Bravery Charm. They can loop Penny with Mimikyu. Mimikyu can actually be very bulky against Minior, as Mimikyu has a 1 retreat, meaning Minior only does 20 damage. So that can obviously be awkward, but being able just immediately knock out Snorlax for free with Minior and being able to constantly go into it every turn with its ability when Snorlax tries to trap something does make this card a pretty versatile Snorlax counter. Another really good card is just Turo Scenario. I mean, we've been seeing decks like Gardevoir and Charizard, even Mew, tech in Turo, because it's one of the best ways to beat Snorlax. If they stall something, you can just Turo it off of the board and then promote your new Pokemon. Now, the argument, I guess, with this is like, well, I can play Turo, but, like, it just makes me play different. Because when you're playing against Control, you don't play your deck like how it's supposed to be played. A lot of the time, you have to play a little bit differently when playing against a Control deck because of the nature of the deck and its playstyle. But I think Turo is a great way to beat Control. As long as you can Turo the Pokemon off the board, you're chilling. Now, yeah, they can have Erica's Hospitality, which can be a little annoying. But again, I think Turo is a good answer. Some other counters is, like, you can go Turo Ultra Ball Super Rod. If you have Super Rod in your deck or Collapse Stadium, you can really take advantage of those cards because you're able to use Rod and Ultra Ball. You can Ultra Ball, you know, the liability into the discard, try to avoid echoing Horn by then super riding it back into the deck. And as long as you just don't reach onto it, you have more time to set up. It ultimately can also come down to what you start with. Like if you open up with Manaphy or Luminion or Squawkabilly against control, there's nothing you can really do. It's just super unfortunate you had to start with your worst Pokemon. But if you're starting with something good like Mewtwo, Charmander, Comfey, whatever the case may be, then it's honestly not that big of a deal. And I think that does mean that, yeah, Snorlax isn't the best deck ever, because sometimes you just don't have the best starts, which it can happen. Also, just naturally playing more Switch never hurts either. If you have a decent bit of Switch in your deck, you're also going to be able to keep up with Snorlax, because every time they trap something, you can just switch out of the active spot. But now we can look at past control decks. So Snorlax Control is obviously a very good deck right now, but I don't think it is the be-all, end-all of the decks. I guess I can switch over here real quick so you can see all the decks. So Snorlax Control might be a very powerful deck, but again, it's not, in my opinion, the be-all, end-all of the stall control decks we've seen in the past. I think there have been much worse decks that have been caused for ban, at least in my opinion. Starting things off, we'll go back to the more recent stall decks. Starting off, we have Yveltal decks here from the Silver Tempest meta. So this card was basically popular when Lugia was the BDIF in the Silver Tempest format, mainly because Yveltal just has a good time into Lugia. You can use Cry of Destruction to discard 3 special energy from Lugia. So basically, you can use Yveltal to discard their Auroras, their powerful energies. All those energies get discarded with Yveltal. It was a very good counter to Lugia, and it's why the Yveltal control deck was so good in the Silver Tempest format. Now, this deck wasn't really a problematic deck. I mean, this deck did have win cons. You had Yveltal for Lugia. You had Ice Cube, which is really good against Regis and Lost Zone specifically. You could put a Wash energy onto your Ice Cube, and then Lost Box, a lot of the time, have no way to beat the Ice Cube. So Ice Cube was another way that they beat, some of the meta decks. And then there was also the Eldegoss Cape of Toughness loop, because at the time, some decks weren't able to do more than 220 damage. Like Arc Dura, for example, had no way to one-shot the Eldegoss V. So a lot of the time, Eldegoss loop was also how you won games. So that was one of the more recent control decks. There was nothing wrong with this Yveltal control deck. This Yveltal Eldegoss Ice Cube deck wasn't problematic for the game. It was a good counter deck because the way the meta was made and the way the meta was at the time, it allowed for a control deck like this to thrive. And this wasn't really that bad of a control deck. It was beatable. You could tech for it. If you wanted to play a Lost Box deck and didn't want to lose to Ice Cube, you could have played a Giratina with Shred or something like that. Or if you wanted to, you also could have played a Yellhorn. I've seen, Regis play Yellhorn in the past as a way to beat Ice Cube, so they can't just lone block face you. Yveltal, Lugia started playing Snorlax Thumping Snore as a way to beat Yveltal, because Yveltal doesn't do anything against Snorlax. So there were ways to beat control, and while this control deck was good, it never was the strongest deck in the format, and it never was as good as Snorlax control, and none of these cards needed a ban, but it was a good example of meta being healthy, allowing for a deck like this to shine. Another recent control deck was obviously the Mewtwo V-Union control deck. This deck won Toronto Regionals. It got top 4 at the World Champion, or NAIC, not Worlds, at NAIC last year. And it was a really cool deck. I think one of the things that made the deck so exciting was it was just a really cool way to play Mewtwo V-Union. No one really thought of this. It was a really unique deck, but the deck itself was all about capitalizing on the meta. There were not many decks out there that had a way to beat Mewtwo. There were some counters like Crobat VMAX, Drapion existed for Toronto, but Drapion fell off at that point. Crobat was one of the biggest threats Mewtwo had to deal with at NEIC, but it still won because it had cards like Miltank and Crushing Hammer, which were extremely powerful and allowed for the Mewtwo Union control deck to win. And then obviously you sit there and super regen loop heal Mewtwo every single turn, which was a very deadly combo. But this deck was never problematic. There was never a reason to ban Mewtwo V-Union. Like, if you played against this deck and your opponent got the Mewtwo up and you had no win con at that point, there was never, a reason to just ban it. I think what made it healthy is that you did get to play the game. Your goal was to try to counter the lock if you can. Try to counter the Mewtwo before it's set up. With Snorlax, I guess the idea is Snorlax just immediately locks you out of the game and it's not fun. Another recent control deck was obviously going to be the Cinccino Mill deck. Now, this wasn't really a control deck, more or less a mill deck, but it did kind of fall in a similar category. The idea is obviously use Cinccino with the supporter card Bella Bryson Man, which was pretty annoying, as basically they just tried to deck you out really, really quickly. They had access to Mewtwo, Tag Team GX with Macargo GX, which milled the top 5 cards of your deck. Basically, it just tried to mill you super fast. Like, when they had access to Oranguru, which unfortunately Oranguru is not on Live's expanded format because I guess it's banned, so I wasn't able to include it here. But they had a Ranguru, which was a very annoying card. There was a reason why a Ranguru got banned. See, that's a card that's worse for the game than Snorlax. Snorlax doesn't need a ban. Guru needed a ban. There's a reason why, Ranguru did get banned, because it was able to get any 3 cards back it wanted. This also enabled other Guru decks, like the Shedinja, a Ranguru deck, where they would spam cards like Zebstrika to try to get their deck down to 0, and then they would basically loop Shedinja every turn on their Ranguru, and basically it made for that you can never take a prize when you're not going to Ranguru, and with the Ranguru's attack to get any 3 cards back from your discard pile, it made for an infinite loop, and it made it for a very powerful control deck. Shedinja Guru was a very strong deck. And those are decks where, Guru should be banned, because it was just too strong. Snorlax is not on the same level as something like a Ranguru was, obviously. Another semi-control deck was Trevnor Milotic. This wasn't really a control deck, but it was a lock deck at the end of the day. And it did something similar where it didn't let you play the game on like their first turn. The idea was they would Milotic, trigger the Trevenant and Dusknoir, and then they would Night Watch for 150, and then they would also spam cards to make your hand super small. And basically you just had no hand, or your hand was extremely tiny going into your turn, and good luck keeping up with that, basically, was the idea. This deck was very strong. It caused Milotic to get banned. This was a good example of another control stall lock deck causing a ban. It was because this was another very strong deck that didn't let you play the game. It wasn't on the same level as something like the Snorlax deck. Another infamous control deck was Dull Stall. Now, this one was pretty dirty. This is one that I'm surprised something didn't get banned, but yeah, Dull Stall was a very strong deck. The idea of this deck is use Florges' ability, Wondrous Gift, where once you're in turn, you can flip a coin. If heads, you can put an item from a discard pile on top of your deck. And then you would then, of course, draw into the item. And guess what item you would put back? You would put back Lily's Pokédoll, which allowed you to basically put it in the active spot, and when it got knocked out, your opponent did not take a prize for KOing it. So, essentially, you just set up like 3 Florges, and as long as you don't flip triple tails, you're guaranteed to get a Lily's Pokédoll back, and you can just immediately loop the Lily's Pokédoll every single turn, and your opponent had no way to take a prize. It was a pretty degenerate deck. That was a stall deck that I think was worse than Snorlax, because that deck actively was just bad. I think that was a worse deck than Snorlax. This was a good example of like a stall deck that was bad for the game. 100% was Dull Stall. Dull Stall was not fun to play against. This was a deck that just was very silly. Now, yeah, you can get lucky and your opponent can flip triple tails on Florges, and then they can't get the Lily's Pokédoll back as easily, but this deck was still good. And at the time, Gust wasn't as popular, and it was more limited than what we have now with Boss's Order and stuff. So that was another reason why this deck was able to be so powerful. This was an example of a bad stall deck for the game, in my opinion. There's also Bird Control, which was also extremely powerful, using Pidgeotto's ability to look at the top 2 cards, put one of them in your hand. You had Articuno GX, and it also, of course, played the infamous Oranguru, and also played cards like Chip Chip Ice Axe, where they would also control the top card of your deck. Chip Chip Ice Axe got banned because that was a card that was not healthy for the game, because unlike with Snorlax Stall, where you can just pass every turn and maybe you have a way to win by, drawing out of it, with the Chip Chip Ice Axe lock, you weren't able to, because they were able to lock the top card of your deck. And that was an example of a bad control deck. I think the perfect example of a bad control deck was Dull Stall or the Pidgeotto control deck, because those decks actively got to a point where you just weren't able to do anything and play the game, all thanks to Chip Chip Ice Axe. And that was not a fun time at all. And this deck also just had infinite Lily's Pokédoll almost, which was just not fun. Some other control decks were Sylveon Control. This was a deck that, when Guardians Rising came out, got a lot of hype. Sylveon Control never ended up being that good, but it did have some decent placements during its run. And this was a deck that basically, they just sat there, Sylveon, use Magical Ribbon, get 3 cards out of their deck, like any energy discarders, like Flare Gun or Plumeria. Then they spammed Max Potion against you to basically heal this thing. They had, I don't think they had Ace or Roll at the time. I think they had another healing card, but Max Potion. But this was another deck where basically they just sat there and tried to make it really impossible to KO Sylveon. But this was never a problematic control deck. Sylveon's control was very strong, but never really that problematic. Another semi-control deck was Eggrow Vileplume, a deck where they could immediately just turn 1 item lock you, preventing you from really being able to do anything right away, is pretty powerful. And definitely, I thought Eggrow Vileplume was pretty bad for the game, because I don't think you should be able to put a Vileplume in play on the first turn of the game and item lock both players immediately. That is a little cheesy. So this was a sort of it's like Trevenant Dusknoir. It was sort of a control lock deck in a way. Excadrill Control saw a little bit of play when this deck got a bit of hype, being able... It was basically a Ranguru, but you get to shuffle 4 cards back to the discard instead of just the 3 like a Ranguru did, but Excadrill ultimately being a Stage 1 did hold it back, but it wasn't the worst control deck. I think it saw a little bit of play. And then finally, there was also Shock Lock. Shock Lock is another very infamous control deck, where basically the idea is they try to infinitely paralyze you, and then they have a Stoutland in the active spot. There's a Stoutland from Boundaries Cross, where if it's in the active spot, you can't play any supporter cards. So as long as they were infinitely paralyzing you, you had no way to get out of the lock because you were paralyzed and supporter locked, which back in the day was a very deadly combo. Shock Lock is a very infamous control lock deck, and it's never a deck that really warranted a ban. Shock Lock actually had pretty good results too. It wasn't just like a meme, it actually was a pretty powerful deck. And Shock Lock is another example of a control stall deck that didn't really need a ban. It was a very strong deck, but I don't think Shock Lock ever got to the point where people are like, this deck needs to be banned immediately. I guess another one was like similar to Snorlax, there was like the Wall Stall deck, which basically used cards like Hoopa, there was a Regigigas, even older Wall Stall decks, like there was also the Wailord deck from, I think it was 2015 Nationals, the Wailord control deck, Wailord Stall, whatever you want to call it. Those are other stall deck control decks that never really were bad for the game. They were annoying to me in the format, but they were never really bad for the game, like Hoopa. Like, you could tech for it. And that's ultimately where it comes down to is Snorlax Control was never as bad as a lot of these other control decks. Like, again, it was never as bad as something like Shock Lock or Doll Stall, Trevenant Dusknoir, Milotic, or even, the Shedinja Ranguru deck or Cinccino Mill when ADP Cinccino were the only two good decks you could play at the time. Snorlax is definitely a deck that I think is not really that bad for the game in hindsight. It's very techable, and I think after this weekend, now that it's won a regionals, now that it's on everyone's radar, I think we're going to probably just see less Snorlax going forward, or at the very least, people are just now going to start respecting it, which is going to diminish its results. The other thing to note, Snorlax is never going to be the most popular deck in the room. It's never going to be that popular. It's always going to be a little fragment of the meta. Like, there's a good chance you could play an entire tournament and not hit a Snorlax deck, because it's just not that popular. So there's always a world where you don't have to respect for it. And if you hit it, you hit it. It just has to be one of those things where if you hit it, you hit it. If you don't respect it, you don't respect it. If you want to respect it, you can, and how you respect it can actually end up allowing you to beat it. As long as you know how to play against the deck, as long as you know what you're doing and you know how to pilot and play the matchup, you can beat it. It's not an impossible deck to beat or anything. You just have to not obviously start with something bad, or you just respect it. It's just that simple. And ultimately, Snorlax does not need a ban. There is no card in the deck that needs a ban. The strongest cards in the deck are going to be the Counter Catcher and the Erica's Invitation, and of course, Snorlax itself, but none of those cards warrant a ban. It's just, with the way decks are being built right now, not many decks really have Snorlax on their radar, and they just kind of are like, well, I'm putting cards in my deck that Snorlax can stall out. Oh, well, okay, but if I cut these cards, then I'm going to lose to other matchups. Like, if I'm cutting Manaphy for my Charizard deck, I'm immediately just losing to, like, Greninja or Shenpao. If I cut Squawkabilly from my Roaring Moon deck, my turn 1 is now very weak. You see what I mean? So, like, it's the nature of the format right now. It's just this deck capitalizes on the format, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think Snorlax is bad. If you really want to beat it, just start teching for it. Start knowing how to pilot the matchup properly. Know how to play against the matchup. Know how to beat it. Tech for it, and you'll be fine. And again, with the deck not being the most popular deck ever, it's not a deck you really have to worry about in hindsight. But yeah, let me know what you think of Snorlax Control down below. Do you think it really needs a ban? I don't think it does. Looking back at other control decks, I really don't think the deck is that bad. Hope you enjoyed the video here on the second channel. I wanted to chime in on my opinions on Snorlax Control, and I hope you all enjoyed. Now, I'll see you on another video here on the second channel. Again, let me know your thoughts down below, and all that good stuff, and bye-bye.